Okay, so we're really lucky to have the speaker here who's here today, because I can't think of anybody who has had more experience and success in trying to implement more equality, diversity in organizations, business corporations, in nonprofit organizations, foundations, and she is the head of the Chicago office of one of the components of diversity search. Diversity search?
Diversified, yeah.
Diversified search in the country, and she's an officer of diversified search, but also she was the head of the Chicago. She is the head of the Chicago office that works on this area, and anybody who knows the field of search knows that it's complicated these days, and that she is proven to be expert in success. So she'll talk more about what she does and the field. But I wanted just to simply say that it's taken us a couple of years to get her here, and largely
there was a pandemic.
That's right. There was a pandemic. Exactly right. So it was. I've known about her actually. I think it's fair to say we've known one another since you were 14 years old. Is that something? I
think probably earlier.
Earlier than that. That's because I visited Chicago and knew part of her family, a lot of her family. In any event, it's a pleasure really to have Alison here. Her parents are good friends. Her uncle, David Levy, was the dean of the law school at Duke for 10 years. And it's a wonderful family devoted to doing good for the country and the world. And so I'm going to leave it at that, because she has a lot of information, I think, to give you, and we're going to have a discussion here of doing it, of how to go about it. And I have a list of questions I want to ask her, and we'll start with, for those of us who may have heard a bit about executive search, but are not that familiar with what you do, can you explain a bit about your unique role in the mission-driven industry?
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here, and what a nice group of connections. And I really, someone said he's a huge Joel Fleischman fan. I am firmly in that camp, and it is a real honor to be here. I grew up with the name of Joel Fleischman being a friend of my parents, and about 15 years or so ago, he started becoming my friend and my professional colleague, and that has just brought me great joy. So it's wonderful to be here. I'll talk a little bit more about my background in a few minutes, because I think that's relevant, but I did want to start out talking a little bit about executive search, because it is this kind of odd niche profession that I knew nothing about, honestly, until I was recruited into it. But it's a very interesting and very influential profession, honestly, where you sit in between the clients and the candidates. So there's two different kinds of executive search. One is called retained search, and one is contingent. Contingent means you are paid only if a candidate takes a job. So it's much more transactional, and it's usually at the lower levels. The executive search that we'll be talking about today is called retained search. And our clients are the organizations and the boards of the organizations, mostly, that are hiring us to do CEO searches. Sometimes we're hired by the CEOs of the organizations to do senior level searches. So it's a very interesting spot to be in, because our clients are the organizations or the companies, but we also are very, very vested in the candidates and the leaders that we are cultivating and then placing. It allows us, I mean, we're really consultants working with our clients, and it also puts us at this intersection of so much that's going on, not only in the economy generally, but especially in the mission-driven field. So we see lots of trends, and because we work across the mission-driven field, we have a subspecialty in philanthropy, but we're seeing all sorts of trends that I think will be interesting, and probably ones that many of you have been seeing. we're often hired by our clients, and I know Joel and I want to talk a lot about this today, to really take them beyond their networks. They will hire us to, often when they're stumped, and they'll say, we really need to make sure that we are going beyond the people we know to find leadership that we might not otherwise consider. What's very interesting about that, and these are trends we'll get into in a bit, is the complexity of helping people find leaders that they might not necessarily know, bringing them to the table, and then making sure that they're really ready to support that kind of leadership. So it's a really interesting juxtaposition. I started my career as an attorney. I had no idea that this field even existed, and I've fallen into it and absolutely fallen in love with it.
You might say a word. I know that my recollection is that the firm that you are leading basically, is a firm made up primarily of women.
Yes. So I started out my recruiting career at a large global firm called Russell Reynolds, which was a terrific training ground. And I was then more and more drawn to a firm that was exclusively focusing on what we call mission-driven search. You'll notice we're not using the word nonprofit. Using mission-driven lets us speak much more broadly. And the firm that I moved my practice to about almost 9 years ago now, is called Koya, and that's really the brand. We're part of Diversified Search Group, as Joel mentioned, but you'll hear Koya in the market, and many of you have worked with us, or some of you are involved with current searches. And that is really the firm that focuses on mission-driven search. It was founded by a woman, and really a wonderful and kind of bald mission, which was to put more women and more leaders of color into positions of power. We don't only place women and leaders of color, but we have, we think, the leading track record in the industry in terms of the statistics that we have. Last year, almost 60% of the leaders that we placed were people of color, and 66% were women. And sometimes people say, well, you're working with nonprofits, or you're working in a mission-driven space, there's more women and more leaders of color. It's not really true at the top level. I see you shaking your head. It's not true at the top level especially. So we are really proud of those statistics, and we can get more into how we accomplish that, but we think we lead the field, and we're really quite honored to be at that place.
Good. How did you find yourself in this role? I know all of us who have been to law school say, well, we believe that it's the most fungible kind of credential to have. Sorry. The question is, how did you find yourself in this role? And I then went to amplify that most people who have anything to do with law school think it's the most fungible kind of credential to have, that's better than an MBA, but I'm not sure that's right. But in any event, I'm looking at Joel Huber, but in any event, you started as a lawyer, a practicing lawyer with a very good firm, and you then, what was the moment at which you decided this was not for you, or there was something else that was more for you?
You know, I might even take it back farther, Joel, if I could.
Sure.
I think if I look at really my earliest years, we were sharing earlier today in a conversation that my parents made the conscious decision to have us, as a family, grow up in Hyde Park on the south side of Chicago. And I didn't really understand it until I got to college at Brown University, where I was studying urban studies, and we learned about my neighborhood and that I had grown up in. And I realized then what a gift it was to be brought up in that kind of environment in a family that was very civically oriented. And I always knew, I looked at the grown-ups in my world as a child, and they were always involved in their community, whether it was very local, regional, national, or global. And I knew I wanted something like that in my life and my career, but I didn't know how I would accomplish that. I also knew I wanted to love what I did, but it was very hard to figure out. I mean, I grew up, I went away to school, came back, I did a joint law and business degree at the University of Chicago. in part because I wanted the duality of those degrees. It's interesting to hear about some of you doing joint degrees. And I did practice law in part because I was interested in having a chapter, but in part because I wasn't sure what else to do, and there was that very clear path into the law. And I did like the law, and looking back on it, because I always say that careers make sense in retrospect, but looking back on it, what I do now is actually kind of similar to the mergers and acquisitions that I did as a corporate attorney, because you're putting people together, you're kind of trying to figure out who's going to do well together and then create this marriage and have them be successful. So in a way, what I do now is not dissimilar, but it was a journey. The fortuitous part of it, Joel, was there was a point in my life where I really wanted something different. And so I was talking to I had gotten senior enough that I was talking with executive search firms about roles that they might have where they could place me with clients. And all of them said to me, we shouldn't place you, you should come work for us. And that was really the first time I hadn't even known what the profession was. And so I was 35, and that's when I started to be able to hear that. And the firm that I went to, Russell Reynolds, was being run by a former attorney from Skadden Arps, which is where I had been. And he said, I know you can make this transition. I've done it, and I love it. So that's why I ended up there as opposed to some of the other firms.
Well, very interesting. Now, what you are known for is for placing women and leaders of color. How have you gone about doing that? I mean, it's different from what most firms do.
It's interesting. We've developed an approach which I think is very simple but really works.
It keeps me right.
So often clients will come to us and they'll start off talking about qualifications. They'll say, I'd like someone with an MBA, or having run a 200 million P&L, or some sort of ticking the box. And so I listen to that, and then I say, let's think about what it is that you want to accomplish. If we were here in 5 years, 3 years, 5 years, what would you be proud to have accomplished with this new CEO? And they say, well, let's think about our aspirations. Let's think about what we want to achieve in this next chapter. So we have that conversation. And then I say, okay, given what I've just heard from you, let's think about what are the leadership qualities, skills, and characteristics that you want in this next leader. And what's interesting is it gets them away from the MBA or the JD or whatever it might be, and it starts opening the aperture. And that's the title of this talk, which is, it's not talking about compromising your standards. It's not talking about, in many ways, it's not even talking about diversity. But you're saying, let's think about what are the leadership qualities, skills, and characteristics. And then you can look at a whole range of different candidates. And it's fascinating when you give people the license to look at candidates in that way, you can really open their minds. And I think that is one of the reasons why we've had such incredible success. We really hold people, we actually take those qualities, skills, and characteristics, we put them in the position profile, in the position description, and then we interview around them, and we have our clients interview around them too. So when we go out into the market, when we're saying we're very proactive about, and we're very aggressive, honestly, about calling people and asking, saying, here's the opportunity, who might be interesting for this? And if they give us 2 or 3 names, we'll say, great, we'd like to have a diverse slate. Are there any leaders of color you might recommend? And oftentimes, I don't know why those names don't come up in the first part of the conversation, but oftentimes when you stop and you say, here's the opportunity, here's the leadership qualities, skills, and characteristics, do you know leaders of color, or do you know women who have that? That's when people will come up with some of the best recommendations. So it's a lot of, it's probing, and it's more work, honestly, but that's where we get some of our strongest candidates. And what's really amazing is when you put the candidates in front of the clients, they will go for them. They will hire them. It's just a matter of putting them together. There's demand and there's supply, and you just need to help them meet one another. And it's wonderful to see.
Tell us a little bit about one or two of your memorable searches, especially in the field of philanthropy, perhaps where you've placed women or leaders of color.
There's so many. It's so fun to think about. We were talking today earlier about a search for the MacArthur Foundation, which is based in Chicago. And many of you probably know they have a program called the Genius Grants. It's MacArthur Fellows program. And they had a long-term leader, and they asked us to do a search for the new head of the MacArthur Fellows program. And so I said, let's not talk about qualifications, because, what could you say about that? And they said, okay, well, we want a polymath. And I said, a polymath, okay. So I went out into the market, and I started talking to all these very interesting people. And after a long time of interviewing extremely bright people, I said gently to the president then of the MacArthur Foundation, we are both really enjoying talking to all these very interesting people, but it's probably time for you to hire someone. But I could have interviewed for that role for years. And we ended up actually going for a wonderful woman named Cecilia Conrad, who, again, on paper, and if you were looking for qualifications, wouldn't have been the right fit. She was an economist. She had been in higher ed. She's a black woman. And she was not, on paper, what they thought they were looking for. But in terms of her leadership and who she is as a leader, she's just been phenomenal. And so she stepped through that door a number of years ago. And what's been really fun to see is how that's evolved under her leadership. She has not only run the MacArthur Fellows program, but also worked with the MacArthur Foundation on their Big Bet program, where they put $100 million behind an idea. She hired us actually a couple years after starting that Big Bet program to help her find someone to run that program. And what we realized as we were doing that search was actually we shouldn't hire someone to run that program, but MacArthur Foundation ended up doing a spin-off. They actually have a whole nother separate organization that's affiliated with MacArthur called Lever for Change, which basically responded to a need in the marketplace, which was when they were doing this Big Bet program, they realized that the MacArthur Foundation was getting approached by all sorts of potential donors, of major donors who were saying, hey, that's great, you're going to fund that number 1 that wins the competition, but could you give us the list of number 2 through 20? We'd really like to know who else is doing really interesting work that you've already vetted that we could fund. And so that Lever for Change that she now runs is now helping connect major donors with all sorts of really interesting efforts around the mission-driven field. So that's an example of a search that was one of my favorites, but then it's been really fun to see her work evolve over the years.
What about some of the more difficult ones? You described earlier, can you all hear what I said? This is not working. There. I'm going to just, if I don't hold my microphone up, somebody hit me. In any event, you were talking earlier today about the difficulty of you're dealing with boards that are trying to choose somebody, and you find yourself in the position of offering them a candidate which you're not sure they can really handle.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
It's a very interesting story.
And I'll give you an example, and it's less, Joel, of whether they could handle, it's whether they could support and set that person up for success. So it's interesting, and this goes directly to putting especially leaders of color, but also women into roles. And we've seen just an explosion of that, of focus on, in particular, putting leaders of color into leadership roles in the last 2.5 years with what's been going on in our society. But we also saw that well before. And this is a story actually from before the COVID and all of the other related factors in our society. We had a large community foundation. So, of course, you all know that community foundations not only give money away, but raise money. So fundraising is an important part of that CEO's role. And we had a very, very strong slate of candidates, and it came down to 2 candidates. One was a male who had led organizations in the past, had fundraised, really strong, was diverse, and essentially the board wouldn't have had to do much. If he came in, they could have just, met every quarter, and he would have handled everything, and he would have done a fantastic job. The other candidate who they were very interested in was what we call a rising CEO. So it was a woman, a black woman who had never been CEO before. She had done some fundraising, but not a lot. And she had the qualities and the skills and the characteristics, but she didn't have, the qualifications. And they decided they wanted to move ahead with her. And we had some pretty tough conversations with that client about whether they were ready to support her. Because what I said to them was, we really can't put her in this role and have her fail. And you are going to need to do a lot more work to support her and to make her successful and the organization successful as a board. Are you ready for that? And the search committee talked about it themselves. They went to the board. They had that conversation and really committed, not only to me, but to her, that they were ready. And it was a very successful placement. But I will say, Joel, to your question, that is a real theme right now, is putting people in positions and not giving them the kind of support to help them be successful, and then having them either fail or move on. And we're already seeing that trend. I see you nodding your head. We're already seeing that trend from some of the placements of the last couple of years.
And tell us again, you said that about 60% of the people you place were women of color, and were people of color, 60% are women as well. Is that growing annually?
Yeah. It's growing annually, definitely. And I would say there's been even a bump in the last couple of years. But this isn't something that we'd focused on just in the last few years. We have built up those relationships and that track record over, 15 years of working in the space. But there's definitely more of a focus on it now, just across the mission-driven field.
Are you working in fields other than, I know about your work primarily from foundations, but you also working with for-profit corporations?
Yes. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Our portfolio in the mission-driven space is we've got foundations. We also work with large social services organizations. We're doing the YMCA search here locally. I've done myself some YMCA searches. We also do a lot of work in arts and culture. That's a very difficult field, especially for leaders of color, to attract leaders into cultural institutions. So we do a lot of work in that field, as well as other parts of the mission-driven field. We have seen a real explosion in clients coming who are corporate clients, for-profit clients, who have mission-driven roles around either corporate foundations or roles that we consider mission-driven that are interesting to us, as well as boards.
Right. And that is too a growing field.
The board practice?
Yeah.
Yes, boards are very interesting, actually. We have seen, I think of our board practice in 3 different aspects. The corporate boards are very interested right now in leaders and women, leaders of color and women. And so we're doing a lot of corporate board work. We're also doing quite a bit of board work with foundations. Foundations are fun to do board searches for because everyone wants to be on the board of a foundation. You get to give money away. And then we're seeing a huge uptick in board searches for nonprofits that are stumped on how to diversify their boards. And they will often say, you know, Allison, we've grown our board organically, and we now need to be much more professional about how we are reaching out and finding new board members. And what's been very interesting about that is that vein of board searches has been funded, by major donors and foundations, our fee, which is not insignificant. We have seen a number of clients where a foundation or a major donor will come in and fund a search or a group of searches. Sometimes we're doing 4 to, sometimes we've even placed 12 people on a board that is funded, that sort of one-time cash infusion by a major donor or a foundation to really set that organization up for the next chapter. So that's a very interesting thing we've seen in philanthropy.
That's fantastic. Do you work with any of the other organizations in the field? I mentioned to you Management Leadership for Tomorrow, which John Rice started, and have you had any opportunity to work with them or at all? You're doing the same kind of thing.
Yeah. You know, there's so much interesting work that's happening right now in the mission-driven space. There's that group. There's all sorts of other groups. Bridgespan, you know, is like us. I mean, they're a for-profit consulting, you know, professional services firm. Right. We think very highly of Bridgespan, and so we have what's wonderful is there's this kind of ecosystem of people working together, and there's a lot happening right now. I would say this is probably the most interesting ecosystem I can imagine after the last few years and kind of thinking about what's next.
Right. I should say to any of the people who are on Zoom who have questions, please feel free to ask them. I think all you need to do is, what do they need to do? They do what? Yeah. Okay. Did you hear what she said?
Yes. Yes.
So, yeah.
They'll put it in the Zoom chat, and then they'll.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, she'll see it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
All you need to do is put it in the Zoom chat, and they will raise you. Anybody starting from?
Just started with one, which is what skills, qualities, and
Characteristics. Yeah. Okay. Great question. So, and it's interesting because at the beginning of each search, there's usually what's called a pitch, and you'll go in and be considered by, unless you're just given a search, which most clients will talk to, you know, 3 different firms. There's a pitch, and in that meeting where they're interviewing you, often clients will say, well, what qualities, skills, and characteristics, or what qualifications, or what should we be looking for? And I am very stubborn about not answering that question, because I will say it's part of our process to help you figure out what you want in your next leaders. But to your question, which is a good one, some of the very common skills that we are seeing right now that are attractive, the skills, qualities, and characteristics, increasingly clients are looking for leaders who can be ambassadors, who are outwardly focused, who can be not only raising money, if that's something that they would need to do, which most of our clients do, but really serving as an ambassador and getting out and being external. It's quite unusual right now for clients to be interested in someone who's just going to come in and manage. That is usually a COO or another person in the organization who's going to be doing a lot of the day-to-day management. We are also seeing, I mean, this is such a basic one, but the leaders who are the most interesting have to have a passion for the mission. whatever that mission is. You can't just come in and say, oh, I've been a banker for 30 years and now I want to give back. And, if you have no track record and no passion for that mission, you're not going to be a compelling candidate. So those are two that we often see. But then often now we're also seeing a real strategic and visionary people who can then get it done. Because the big pie in the sky strategy and vision without being able to actually run a team or run a process to implement is kind of over. So those are three of the themes that I've seen a lot.
We did have, if I could take that. We did have one follow-up.
Okay.
Someone asked, and how do you screen for them?
So that's a really good question. So a lot of what we do when we're interviewing against those is we will ask for specific examples. We're very interested in examples of how people have done what they might do in the future. Again, it's not having done it exactly in the same way, but how they have had an example that's relevant. So we talk to the candidates about specific examples. We set our clients up to screen against those in those interviews. We also talk to people who know the candidates. We're very good at going out into the market and hearing about people we think might be interesting and interested. And even before we call them, we might call 4 or 5 other people that we know them and see if their name comes up in a conversation. And if it doesn't, we'll say, oh, this name has come up in conversations. What do you think of that person? And they'll say, oh, yes, that's a great idea. I didn't think of that. Or, oh, that person couldn't manage their way out of a paper bag, and you need that here. So we're learning a lot from lots of different aspects and inputs. We also do assessments and deep referencing. So there's a whole kind of portfolio around screening.
Allison, I could talk to you all day. I have so many questions. So glad you're here. I used to be an executive director, so followed.
I saw you nodding at a couple of my comments.
And then stepped away. So a question that I have is, how do you define board readiness for new leadership? So you talked about support, but I'm curious around, do you do assessments of boards' ability to actually support your candidates? And if you mentioned in this example that you had a conversation, but are there some skills or capacities that boards actually need when diversifying their leadership?
So are you talking about boards being put on a board of directors?
No, when you're hiring for a CEO or an executive director, and you talked about the board needs to be ready to support
I see what
the
you mean.
new leader. Yes. How do you define that readiness? And similar question, are there some competencies or skills that you think boards should be having in order to create conditions for leaders of color or women to thrive?
That is such a terrific question, and it's a really evolving one. We were talking earlier today about all these articles that are coming out about this exact topic. I don't have the perfect answer for you. Some of it is, our gut and our experience in digging deep with the clients early on in the search when we do the constituent conversations, where we can just work with them to hear how they are thinking about leadership. And, if you have a client who says, well, we need to put in a Black person now because we haven't had one, that's not an answer. That is not a really legitimate way to think about your next leader. So we will push them pretty hard. I will tell you, in addition to us pushing and learning as much and having those candid conversations, the candidates are doing that now too, and they should. Candidates are in the driver's seat now in a way that is, I think, exciting, and I hope we don't go back too much from where they are now. There are a huge demand for strong candidates, strong women candidates, and leaders of color. And a lot of them are saying, I don't know if that board is going to be able to help me be successful. And those are hard conversations to have with boards, because We have candidates who are at a, they're going through a CEO search, and a lot of the times they're involved in 2, 3 other searches, and they may end up with 2 or 3, sometimes 4 competing offers at a time. And one of the things I've seen a lot lately is candidates who have an offer where it's it's a terrific mission, but it's got some challenges. They're not sure the board's going to be right there with them. And, a few years ago, they might have been like, yeah, let me at it. And then there's another opportunity, which is much more straightforward. They're pretty sure they can be successful, and it's not as complicated. Right now, they're going for that second. I think there's a bit of exhaustion now over the last few years. There's a lot of reasons why people are doing that, but they're in the driver's seat, and they want to be successful and have impact. And so it's led to some pretty difficult conversations with some of our clients. One of the things that I say is when they get frustrated and they say, why can't you attract the right candidates? We will say, we don't make the market, we reflect it. And, if we can't get a candidate across the finish line, it may be because of the organization and of the attractiveness to the candidate. And those are hard conversations to have.
Joel.
Alison, this is terrific from my perspective. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I have to, this is terrific, particularly from my perspective, a business perspective. And I think decisions on deans, on candidates, on schools are ones we screw up all the time. And I really like what you do. What I'd like to talk to you more about is your Rolodex, what we used to call a Rolodex. So you now are in touch with, I'm going to say, in a given year, 1,000 different people in various ways. How do you manage that in the sense of, think of 2 things, people that you've gotten jobs for, that you go back to them to talk to them. You've got informants, you've got people who came in second or third and you want them in another place. So in some sense, you've got all this information, so when somebody says, I want this, you should have a way to find a dozen people that might fit that.
Yeah.
Does that happen other than in your brain?
Yes. Well, we have a huge database and all of that, but it really is a bit, kind of the art and the science. There's the science, which is the database and mapping things out, and then there's the art of those relationships. People often ask me what I think a good recruiter should, what qualities they should have, and one is you have to love people and be fascinated by people, because if you're not fascinated by them, you will lose patience with what we do. Find them fascinating, be innately just super curious all the time, and be, I think, a people collector, which is kind of what you were talking about. LinkedIn and some of those other ways of keeping in touch with large groups of people are terrific. We send out kind of email announcements, but a lot of it is, in this day and age, people aren't talking to each other. What's so fun is actually calling people and have them pick up the phone and they're like, oh, I can't believe you actually called me. And it's especially happened in the last 2.5 years in our society, and I don't quite understand why. We've all gotten COVID, but why? Wouldn't that have made us more picking up the phone? I don't understand it. But actually talking to people is so amazing, because that's where you get the really good ideas, where you just you can say, could I have a 5-minute conversation? And oftentimes that is the magic of it. So I use the phone a lot, or email too. But sometimes there's definitely, people that I have on my list that I would love to place. I think to myself, I would be really honored to place that person. And a number of times over the course of my career, I've actually had the perfect search come in, and I've known that I think that person's going to be the right person, and still put a slate around them. But that's a pretty unusual thing to have happen. But what I would say is to everybody, be nice to the recruiters, because answer their calls, make yourself useful, give them ideas, talk to them and tell them what you are interested in, because then when a really cool job that you actually are interested in comes up, then you'll be one of their first calls. And it's interesting when I talk to people and they say, oh, I've never really talked to recruiters because I like what I do. I say, start talking to the recruiters, even if you like what you do now, because you want to know them, because they can help you when you're interested.
Allison, they asked 2 good questions, and I was sitting here thinking, I've got 5 good questions, and 2 of them have already answered and asked, so
Good.
yay. Thank you, guys. You mentioned in several different spaces in your talk this notion of growing a board organically, or somebody will call you and you ask into their community, what's this person like? And so reputation in network tends to matter tons. 100% understand that. So let's say you're somebody who's in a position of power, who's not a person of color, who's not a woman, and is trying to grow a diverse group of people around you in whatever frame that may be. It seems to me like that network and that reputation matters so much. And I struggle personally expanding the diversity of my own network. So how would you, given that this is what you do for a living, go about doing that? How would you try and make sure that when that recruiter calls me and says, hey, are you interested in this job? I say, no, but I know somebody good who should get a look. How do you go about diversifying your own network, I guess, is the quick way to ask that question.
You know, it's so interesting. I actually think now, I was going to say it's really easy now because there's so much information on the web and out there about people. But I actually think that it's really hard right now because people have retreated into their silos, and it feels much more insular in many ways now than in the last, than earlier. So I hear you. I would just be, I would almost be disciplined with yourself about it, and almost, what I tell people often is like, pretend you have to write a research paper, in school. Here we are in school, and do the research. Think to yourself, come up with a thesis statement. Who are the people doing interesting work in X field, right? And then spend literally half an hour. You can learn so much on the web, and then figure out how to pick up the phone and call them or reach out to them. People will respond. What's really interesting in this mission-driven space is people oftentimes will talk to you because people are interested in doing good and being helpful. So I often find the best ways, it's not calling people asking them for something, but it's calling them to tell them about something interesting, or not actually asking them to do something for me, but say, I just wanted to let you know about X, or would you be interested in, being part of what Joel does? But I would challenge yourself, because I think people will be receptive if you do that, what I found.
Thank you so much for being here. So my question is about young people and networking, because I think that beyond, I think what you said is extremely important about diversifying boards in terms of race, gender, sexuality. But my question is about incorporating young voices into these spaces. I think a lot of times people my generation network in different ways, and a lot of times it's incorrect. I feel like people going on LinkedIn and social media without making those genuine connections. So how do you think about getting those young people in these spaces and interacting and networking with people from a different generation?
Thank you for asking that question, because it's something that's on my mind a lot. And it ties not only in with networking, but also with workplace right now, and the whole idea of working together, working remotely. How is this going to work? What's our future of the workplace? And I may be a bit old-fashioned, but I think there is nothing like sitting in this room with you all, and just the power of human interaction. So I would say the networking that you can do, if you can possibly do it in person, and try and find a job where you will have a boss that you will work with physically, like in the same physical space. I think there is nothing like that. Maybe it's a hybrid arrangement, but those kinds of relationships that you build at that age are, foundational. And I'm very worried, quite frankly, about, people, young professionals now, college students and people in their 20s. I manage a lot of them, and I had a real journey in the last 2.5 years and trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. I think networking, if you can find ways to network around, it's so hard to go to a networking event where you're just kind of like, hey, but if there's a theme that, where it's clear that you're interested in something mutual, that's a little easier. My husband is he runs a venture firm that invests in early stage climate and clean tech companies. And he just had an event in September and in Chicago, and it was fascinating because I watched all of these young people who a few years ago would have come kind of rumpled, really awkward. They all showed up like you couldn't believe. With coat and tie. I mean, it was so fast. I was like, did your moms help you here or what? Like these, especially the young men, they were all dressed up. Unlike before COVID, they were out there, shaking people's hands, and they were all asking, how do I network? How are there other opportunities like this? Where can I meet other people? There is a real need. There's a huge energy right now around people, I think, around your age who are interested in that kind of networking. But they were all able to connect because they were there around a common theme, and it was more comfortable for them as a result.
Jacob, would you like to tell them about your practice in meeting people?
Sure. Well, I'll talk to you more about this after.
Okay.
But basically, I've spoken to thousands of people in the pandemic. So
Good.
basically, I started this project in COVID because I was just, in college and I didn't really have anything, I wasn't really learning the right way. So
Yep.
it's just kind of a way to meet people and kind of expand my perspective.
Terrific. I would love to hear more about it, and congratulations,
Thank you.
because
Called me up cold.
Uh-huh.
Never met me before, and he said he would like to talk with me. And I said, what about? He said, I have a mission of getting to meet faculty members whom I hadn't been in classes with, but I would like to meet them. And what's the number here?
Yeah, I'm currently at 5,600 around. I have to keep track of it.
So Damon, I would say, I think he just gave you a great example.
What about your role?
Thanks for the interesting discussion today. I had a question about the candidates that you've placed at organization, especially those who are people of color, and especially if they have been placed in organizations that are predominantly white.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever follow up with those candidates to see if there are any insights or anything that they could contribute to help you, either refine your strategies or just some helpful things that you've learned from them?
We do. We keep pretty close to the candidates that we place. We feel very vested in their success, and we learn from them. We've refined our process significantly because of things we've learned over the years. And we also, it helps us identify trends of clients who, who aren't necessarily making the most sort of hospitable and productive environments for the leaders we place. It's a tough spot for us to be in, to try and help navigate it if it's not going well, but we do learn a lot from them. I will say, going back to some of the earlier conversations, this is an area that is really evolving quickly right now, and there's all sorts of interesting articles, I think, that I've been seeing about supporting the people that you recruit to do well, and are the workplaces keeping up? Are the employers keeping up with that? And also, how do you help them? I mean, I know as a manager myself of a large team of people, over the last couple of years, I've read all these articles about, well, leadership should do this and management should do that, or, you know, but I don't know how to do that necessarily. And so I think part of it is helping companies and leaders and equipping them with how do you make this environment where a diversity of employees can be successful. So it's a great topic right now, and I think it's evolving, and I don't have clear answers for it.
Hello again.
Hello again.
So I have two questions. One, you said you see trends, and I'm curious, you've named some, what other trends you're seeing in the market. And then the other, which is similar to the question you asked, which is a question I was going to ask, was around climate surveys. So you are learning a lot about what allows women and people of color to thrive. And I'm curious, have you seen any climate surveys that can be predictors of whether or not institutions are prepared for the leadership of women or people
It's interesting.
of color?
I haven't personally seen the climate surveys, but I think I do know that people are using more and more kind of surveys to learn, and I think that's an interesting. I've heard a lot about almost those sort of quick pulse surveys, which I think are an interesting kind of adjacent to that. I would say some of the themes that we've been seeing, there's some really interesting themes right now in our work broadly. I mean, I can just throw out a few that might be interesting. I talked about candidates being in control, which I love. Another aspect that's really interesting is compensation. With the new laws that have been passed, and in New York just came into effect yesterday, where we used to be able to say, where are you now in terms of compensation, and where would you like to be to make a move like this interesting? We can't ask that anymore, and it's great. Because what happened when we did that was people would say, well, I'm at 150,000 now running this nonprofit. I would like to be at 200. Well, you know, let's say the outgoing person was at 250, and then we just found out that we could get this person for 200. Well, what the new laws do is they protect women and leaders of color primarily, and all of us, because they say you need to pay what the job is worth. And so that has actually really helped candidates because it's completely shifted, and it's actually been very chaotic in a really interesting way the last few years, because our clients are very frustrated. They say, well, ask them how much they're making now. And I say, I can't. And then they'll say, well, go on their 990 and look. And I say, well, I've already done that, but I can't factor that into the conversation. You need to figure out, what is this job worth? And so that's that whole compensation and pay equity and all of that is super interesting right now. And I think it's going to settle, but right now it's really kind of uncharted territory. I think right now there's a really interesting trend. I don't know if this impacts many people here, but I've seen in the last even a month or so, I feel like as COVID came in, rolling in, we've seen new themes emerge almost every quarter. Like literally we're seeing a whole set of trends just every few months. One thing that I've seen in the last month is all sorts of very senior women who are in their 40s and 50s deciding that they were at the top of their game before COVID. They got their families, their teams, their companies, whatever it might be, through to this point. Everyone's sort of focused on summer, and now they're putting their heads up and they're saying, what's in it for me? What's my next chapter? I quit. And it was so funny because I was just talking to my husband about it, and then I saw an article last week that was saying that senior women are just quitting in droves right now. So there's all of these kind of interesting things happening in the field that we're seeing, and some of it's just happening immediately, just as we're moving through.
I guess that kind of, oh, sorry. Just a kind of follow-up. Is there any sort of, do people know why that is? Or not quite yet?
On that theme
Yeah,
in
on that
particular?
theme, sorry, yeah.
I think it's, in a way, people are exhausted. People have been caring. A lot of, leaders have been really caring for their people, whoever it is, like, their companies, their teams, their families. And, they're putting their head up now and saying, what do I want my next 10 or 15 years to be? We're also, I think there's a lot of reimagining right now of reimagining the workplace, reimagining relationships, reimagining how you're going to support your employees. And it's pretty clear we're not going back to the whatever normal was, and that's good. But there's just so much shifting right now. I think we're just going to be picking this chapter apart for decades, like looking back on this and saying that was a fascinating time.
Sorry, I just had have you noticed any patterns among organizations that haven't been equipped to support their leaders in the way that you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, we've seen clients, some of them very well-known clients, where they have tried to bring in leaders. That one theme, interestingly, is leaders who are brought in to lead diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So, chief diversity officer or whatever the title might be. There was just an article last week that the average tenure is about 18 months. I think a number of folks who are brought into those roles are not set up for success and they're leaving. So we're seeing clients who are struggling. It's hard to turn around, especially a big organization that may have just decades and decades of kind of history. And I feel for leaders right now. It's not an easy time to really try and pivot and do the right thing. But a lot of them are trying to do the right thing, and just it takes time.
I have a question about nonprofits that
Yeah.
are your clients, or just your knowledge about this in general. So, because the talent market is so competitive right now, I worry about nonprofits losing talent because of competitive offers, for example. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any trends in, talented leaders or future leaders, women, people of color, who are either leaving nonprofit organizations for better, offers, or if you see any sort of ways that nonprofits that have been successful in like attracting talent when they might not have the same compensation that they can offer people.
Well, it's interesting. There's a bunch of different, I think, competing things happening. Nonprofits aren't able to pay as much, but they are realizing that they need to pay more. And so I do think we're seeing a bit of a right sizing with compensation. It's going to catch up. It's going to take a few years, but a lot of nonprofits are realizing they need to figure out how to retain and to probably end up paying more. We are seeing people leave nonprofit and going into the corporate sector and make more, but I would say we're seeing more people who, after the last few years of upheaval, are saying, what do I want to do with my life? And what is my mission? And how do I want to leave the world after I'm gone? And there's a lot of people who are leaving the less mission-oriented. I don't even want to say for-profit, because there are mission-oriented for-profits. But if you don't have a sense of meaning in your world, that's what people are seeking. So they are coming to the mission-driven sector. And that's a really, I think, healthy thing.
I'd like to talk a little bit about age.
Okay.
About, think of a life cycle. People go through age and life cycle. That's us, Joel. We're old. And I'd like to look in two perspectives. First, if you're going to have a person do a new jump in their career, what's the best age? And I want to qualify on that. Does it matter if it's male or female? Sort of when are they ready for a jump? and age may have to do with the age of their children too. So
Yeah.
I want a sense of life cycle and how you.
Do you mean a jump like into
Okay.
mission-driven work or just a jump generally?
Well, it could be general, but with mission driven, yeah, no, I think it's general because when are people ready for a big jump, and what? Yeah, will make you go, or step to a different.
Yeah.
That's a big jump, but there actually has to be well fit for it. But and you must ask something about their lives.
Yeah.
That's like their children, their wives, the whole is ready for that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So now, legally, you need to focus discussion on what is it that will help them do this job. So you can't actually ask a lot of questions about family and things like that. But the way I like to get to know my candidates is I say, tell me your story and tell me who you are. And let me tell you a little bit about myself and invite you to tell me whatever might be interesting to share. So I end up getting people to talk with me about their lives. And I do see some themes. I'm not sure you can sort of say anything in too big of a generalization, but there are definitely themes. One time I see people moving on is when they've kind of outgrown their organization, right? So that can be at any different point. When they've gone and they've done a great job and they're ready for something new. They're just at that point. So that can be really at any point. That moment of when, like children, if you do have children, there's some sort of break points, going into high school or graduating from high school. And so we see a lot of people being receptive to moves at those different personal points. One of the things that I always say to clients, because you can't, unless it's a board search, you're not allowed to talk about age. But of course, clients will, and they'll say, well, all sorts of things. But what we say is focus on that person and whether they have, do they have the energy? Are they going to throw themselves in? Because one of my favorite placements early on was someone who was retiring from a role, and it made financial sense for them to retire. And he was the kind of, you'd text him at 4 a.m. and he'd text you back at 4:02. I mean, this guy was on fire. And he gave 7 years of his life in his 60s to an organization that he left in a much better place. And he was fantastic. And so catching him at that moment was right for him. I will tell you, interestingly enough, another theme that I'm seeing right now is not only organizations that are looking for young people who they can groom and fresh talent. I have a lot of clients who have been saying to me in the last year or so, maybe year and a half, do you got any grown-ups? Like, is there anybody who's like mature, who's been around the block, who knows what they're doing? I don't have to explain everything to. I can delegate to this person. I know it's just going to get done. Do you got any grown-ups? And I love that because I think that is another way to add diversity. You've got people who aren't going to, be the same age. I love that question. And I've seen a lot of women coming back into the workforce. And that's really fun to see. So I like the grown-up question.
Are there common skills and experience levels that your clients look for in in candidates for leadership roles?
Just in terms of, give me a little bit more, or is that one of the questions from up there?
Oh no, it's just me.
Okay, tell me a little more.
Just I guess in leadership positions at like a nonprofit or something.
So I would say if you're thinking about the kinds of experiences that most boards, as you get more senior, are looking for, definitely if you have the opportunity to step into leading some sort of strategic aspect, that's often as you get higher up, they're looking for that kind of experience. Managing people can be a gating factor. Even if you're not going to be managing a bunch of people directly as the leader, they want to know that you can manage. And most organizations, if you get to the top level, they're going to want to know that you either have raised money or you can, and you're willing and excited about doing that. And that even if you haven't, come up the development path, for example, you have the kind of personality that would say, game on, I'll do this. So those kinds of things are important to kind of see if you can work into your portfolio as you're moving up.
Any other questions? I have one question. That shows you how fast Cassie is. She jumped up to come up here and tell me to use the microphone. You clearly enjoy working with your colleagues as well as your clients. Tell us about your teams within your organization.
I have to say, it's brought me great joy to hire and develop people. I love that. And we have 3 pillars that we talk about on our team. So we focus on culture, professional development, and excellence in all we do, internally and externally. And so all 3 of those are real pillars. And going back to, we talked about some of the qualities I look for, that curiosity, and on my team also, you have to be very detail-oriented. The former lawyer that I am, everything has to be right before it goes out to the client. But I would say, that managing teams, as we were talking about earlier, it's brought me great joy, but it's also been challenging the last few years as, trying to manage folks who weren't used to working at home, and we were working all the time. We were so busy. We had never seen anything like the demand, and I was trying to get my teams to get outside and to not work. And so that was hard to manage. And now this whole question of how do you effectively mentor and apprentice people, but try and do that in a hybrid environment, has been much more challenging for me than I anticipated. And it's something that I'm really focused on, in part because I just love bringing people along.
Perhaps one of the reasons that you're as successful in placing people is that you really do like recruiting people that you will enjoy working with.
Yeah.
And you know it from personal experience.
Yeah.
No other questions now? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, wait. You have to have the microphone.
So our folks on Zoom can hear you.
So you've now mentioned remote work a couple times as it relates to mentoring and growing people. What about for candidate searches and stuff? Are you seeing a mix of expectations for relocation, or some jobs now being remote?
It's changed a lot. I've seen a real hesitancy to relocate in the last number of years, unless it makes sense for people and their own personal situation. People are asking about doing work remotely, working remotely, and clients are really trying to figure out if that's going to work for them. A lot of clients are saying, we'll go remote, and I think that may make sense for the short term to attract talent, but I look forward to 3 years, 5 years from now, and I'm worried for them on a cultural sense level and on professional development. I actually have one client, which was very unusual, but he is someone who I know very well and thinks like I do. So I wasn't surprised to hear this from him, but he said, I'm offering this role as a fully remote role. Is that going to be unattractive to people? And I thought that was very interesting, because usually people are saying, oh, it's more attractive because you can work from anywhere. And he was saying, I'm not sure I would want that job. I would want to be with colleagues. And do I want a person who is not going to want to be around colleagues? So it's a very complicated conversation. And I'm not saying people need to be together all the time. And I know there's a lot of complexity around that whole conversation. But I do think that humans that kind of interaction and developing people, there is something about being in person.
Well, I can't thank you enough for coming. And before you all applaud her, let me just say that, to remind you that we have one more speaker in this series in the fall semester. Antonia Hernandez is the head of the Los Angeles Community Foundation. She's been in that job, I think, for 20-some years. She's done a marvelous job. She's coming to speak. And then in the spring semester, we're having Carol Stern, who's the head of the Walton Family Foundation.
She's been a client. She's wonderful.
Is that right?
Yeah.
The people, I haven't met her, but
She's great.
I've heard good things about her. Rip Rapson, have you met? You know Rip.
I know Rip.
People say a lot of good things. He's been here every other year.
I heard.
So we know he has a fan club here. Ginny Esposito, the head of the National Center for Family Philanthropy, and John Palfrey, who you know very well, placed at the MacArthur Foundation.
John Palfrey he's wonderful. You should definitely come to see him. He's one of my favorites.
So two
too.
out of the four, and then there's one fifth, Barbara Pickauer, who's the head of the JPB Foundation. So that's the spring term group, a very interesting, diverse group, all of them doing really interesting stuff. So with that, I just want to thank you for coming. And, you know, it has been an absolute delight to hear you respond to the questions, to have it. I mean, you know, meeting somebody you've known for a lot of years you've never met before. It's a great, and I mean, you really have come out really well.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Joel.
So I thank you for coming. I thank you for your wise comments, and I hope you'll come back again.
Thank you so much. It was a real treat. I enjoyed it.
Okay.